Okay, so I'm so happy that we can have Rick Searle here to give us a presentation tonight. And as you've seen, Rick's been part of the society for a while, but we don't often get to see some of the great work that he's doing when he's not volunteering with the VNHS, and sharing some of his great photos also in the magazine. So Rick Searle is a Victoria-based tour guide and naturalist. Since 2016, he has worked as a tour guide with several American and Canadian companies that have an educational focus. So prior to this, in previous incarnations, he has done so many amazing things, including leading the creation of the education and engagement programs for Ocean Networks Canada. He's taught senior level courses at UVic and at Royal Roads. He's co-produced and co-hosted environmental magazine show and environmental radio programs. He's an author of a nonfiction book on challenges facing national parks in Canada. He's written numerous articles for different magazines, nationally and internationally. Rick has also provided consulting services to Parks Canada and BC Parks, CRD Parks, and Islands Trust Funds. And then he started his professional career as an interpreter naturalist with Parks Canada and Manitoba Provincial Parks. Since the early 90s, Rick has grown increasingly alarmed by the escalation in climate change. And needless to say, his work as a tour guide necessitates significant amounts of travel each year, has come with a mounting ethical dilemma. It came to a head while leading a tour to view polar bears near Churchill, Manitoba this past November. While being awestruck by these magnificent animals, he simply could not shake the pervasive feelings of guilt for being there. So thank you so much, Rick. I will pass it over to you, and you can share more about your experiences with the polar bears in Churchill.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. So a caveat before I begin. I'm not a biologist. I'm a geographer. I'm much more interested in the relationship between people and place. And in this case, the place is Churchill, and all of that entails, obviously, the polar bears is a big reason that people come. So happen here. Okay, good. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get going here. Where is it? Geez, I had it up just a minute ago. Where'd it go? Oh, fiddle. Sorry about this, folks. I had it up. We just did a run through with it. Where'd it go? There we go. Can you see that now?
Not yet, Rick, but maybe it'll take a moment.
No. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, we're going to try that again. It seems like I got bounced out. We're going to try that again. There we go. There we go.
Yep, here it comes.
All right, now you should be seeing it.
We've got it there. Thanks so much, Rick.
All right. Oh, not a problem. Not a problem. Okay, so here we go. Polar bears of Churchill. Now you see them, and soon you likely won't. I wish that I could be giving a positive, uplifting presentation, but as you'll hear, the future for the polar bears in and around Churchill is grim, to say the least. To begin with, though, let's talk a bit about the polar bears and a bit about their background, their history, their natural history. Polar bears and grizzlies, of course, as we know, are very closely interrelated. In fact, we have interbreeding going on, even in and around Churchill. We got Bisleys, or growlers, as they're sometimes called. Polar bears are a distinct species. Recent studies have identified that polar bears and grizzlies separated roughly 1.3 to 1.6 million years ago. And that was studies using very advanced techniques in genomics. as I just mentioned, we do know that they continue to interbreed, even though they are separate species, which goes to prove that love is blind. Um, so, uh, how did this happen? How did the polar bears come to be? Uh, the polar bear expert Andrew DeRocher, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, has theorized that the grizzly from the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska expanded northwards and continued to expand further and further north. And it's theorized that as a hungry grizzly bear would emerge from the den, the sea ice would look quite indistinguishable from the land, and they would venture out looking for carrion. At that time, seals existed and were a naive prey and easy for the grizzlies to hunt down. And it again theorized that in hunting the in hunting the seals, these grizzlies became more and more successful and therefore able to raise more young. And so the over time then the selective pressures then started to lead to certain adaptive changes. I should add that seals, in particular the ring seals, are extremely high in fat. Anywhere from 34 to 76% of their body weight is fat. One ring seal can provide a polar bear with enough energy to last for 11 days. So what are some of those adaptations that the polar bears have to the Arctic environment? Well, one is the large size, as you can see. Um, they are the largest land-based carnivore. The males alone can weigh up to 3/4 of a ton, 1,500 pounds. They're bigger than a grizzly bear. And the size of them, the volume to surface ratio, is what enables them to stay warm. Um, Small ears, small tail, of course. I mentioned they eat fat. They are fat. Polar bears should be fat. They have up to 4 inches of fat surrounding them, or that's 10 centimeters. They have a very thick fur. The fur, as it appears to us, is white, but the fur is hollow and transparent, and as the light passes through it, it appears light or white, pardon me, and that is likely an adaptation to allow them to blend in with snow and ice that makes them better hunters of the seals. The fur is also water repellent. It has an oil on it that helps them shed water, but even polar bears can suffer from hypothermia. And so when they come out of the water, they must shake as much water off and roll in the snow to remove the water. Water, as you know, is an excellent conductor of heat away from one's body. So massive bears, big paws. Look at those size of those paws. The paws actually enable them to walk across snow and ice, distribute the weight. They're kind of like snowshoes. That really helps out. Um, Polar bears, when you look at this polar bear, you'll see its tongue is sticking out, and you'll note the color of the tongue. It's black. The skin of a polar bear is black, and it's theorized that the black skin helps absorb whatever little bit of warmth there is from the sun during the winter months. I might add that this adaptation of black skin is certainly not of an advantage in a warming climate. As you'll see on this polar bear in its hind paws, there's these black parts. These are covered with very small, soft bumps. And these bumps combined with the claws are what gives the polar bear its traction on ice. So all of these adaptations then enable the polar bear to exist in its environment. Uh, One other really interesting adaptation, notice the length of this bear's neck. It's almost disproportionate to the body. Um, and you'll notice that the head is very small compared to the neck. This is an adaptation as well for hunting seals. The polar bear will stalk the seal to try and get as close as possible, and then it will do a very rapid, fast charge. Polar bears cannot run for a very great distance because of that heavy coat. They overheat, so they have to get as close as possible before they make their charge. The seals are very quick to plunge back into their breathing hole, and the polar bears are known to literally plunge into that hole after the seals. And so the long neck and the narrow head are an adaptation then for chasing those seals down their breathing holes. Take a look at these fangs. So this is the upper fangs of a polar bear. They're roughly 5 centimeters long or 2 inches. And then the incisors across the top. And we've got a similar kind of set of teeth across the bottom. It's pretty apparent that if they ever get a grasp of a seal, it's not going to get away too easily. These big canines can readily puncture the skin of a seal. Polar bears have a bite force that's equivalent to about 1,200 pounds per square inch. Compared to humans, which have a PSI of roughly 120 to 160, it gives you a very dramatic comparison in terms of that bite force. So when a polar bear grasps a seal, it's not likely to get away. And once the seal has been hauled out onto the ice, then what the bear does is it uses those incisors to literally strip the skin off and then peel back the blubber. That's all that the polar bear is interested in, is just the blubber. The rest of the carcass is left and becomes a feast for things like the Arctic fox and other animals. Let's take a look at the distribution of polar bears. So worldwide, there is no one nomadic population of polar bears. Rather, they're broken into 19 subpopulations. The IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group in 2021 estimated that the total polar bear population at present is around about 26,000 bears. Canada is home to 16,000 of those 26,000. That's 2/3 of the world's population. So we have a tremendous heritage here, remarkable in the global perspective. Because data is so deficient in most of these subpopulations, it's very difficult for the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group to even get a sense of what's happening with those subpopulations, whether they're increasing, decreasing, or remain the same. Having said that, though, the Polar Bear Specialist Group has gone out on a bit of a limb, and they have said that there is no subpopulations that have increased over the long term, and that at least 3 populations, subpopulations, are in severe decline. So now let's move in and take a look at the Hudson's Bay the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation, centered around Churchill. The red dot marks where Churchill is. So you can see it's almost at the top of the province. It's about a 3-hour flight from Winnipeg. The only other ways of getting in there, other than flying in, is by sea or by rail. And to travel by rail from Winnipeg up to Churchill is about a 36-hour, on a good day, travel. What some tourists have done, they've started driving up to, say, Thompson and boarding the train there, and that saves you roughly 20 hours. Um, so those are the main ways that you can get in. Churchill, as we know, started off as a Hudson's Bay trading fort back in the 1700s, coming up through into the 1800s. Where Churchill really began to grow is with the presence of the military during the 1940s through 50s and into the 60s. Churchill was chosen as a place by the U.S. Air Force for one of its strategic air command bases. This was part of the early DEW line um, development. And that was during the 40s. And then during the 50s and 60s, it became the support center for the Churchill rocket range. So at that time, Churchill reached a population, a peak population of about roughly 6,000 people. The base was closed in 1981. Most of the buildings were demolished, or 1961, pardon me, 1981, the base was closed. Buildings were demolished. A few were repurposed for Churchill's airport and also for the Churchill Northern Studies Center. In 1997, um, the federal government chose to sell off the terminal, the grain terminal that had been built in the 1930s with the arrival of the rail line. And they sold off not just the port, but also the rail line to a U.S. company. By 2016, that U.S. company had decided to close it. In 2017, as many of you know, the rail line washed out during heavy rains and likely due to a beaver dam bursting. Only recently, the 2021, the terminals, the marine tank farm, and the rail line were sold to a consortium of about 30 First Nations and non-Indigenous communities in the north in combination with one large corporation. The result today is that the current population is around about 870 to 890 people. During the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, while the military were there, they would dig trenches around the fort and throw their garbage in it. This, of course, attracted the polar bears. And it's rumored that many of these polar bears, many of the polar bear skins and heads were shipped off as trophies by some of the service people on the base. But it wasn't just the base that was doing this. The town of Churchill also had an open pit garbage, and it was not uncommon for families to drive out to watch the bears as they came into the pit, into the garbage pit. Unfortunately, and not surprisingly, this practice of having an open pit garbage dump attracted bears into the town. And for a period of time, the polar bears were viewed more as vermin than as a majestic animal that we now view it as. And during this time, the polar bear population actually bounced back from a low that was resulted during the time that the base was there. As I mentioned, a lot of bears were killed at that time, and the population began to bounce back in the early 70s. Late 60s, early 70s. And during this time, we saw a spate of maulings and a few people killed. The response of the Manitoba government at that time was to have conservation officers shoot problem bears. And as many as 29 polar bears a year were dispatched with. During the late 1970s, mid to late 1970s, though, attitudes began to change, with more residents now becoming concerned about the fate of the polar bears and wanting to find ways to live with the polar bears. In 1979, the first tour operator went into business, and that's Frontiers North. And in 1982, the Polar Bear Alert Program was established. And here you see the sign that greets you when you come into the Churchill Airport. Welcome to Churchill, Polar Bear Country. A lot of rules or encouragements, guidelines, if you will, posted right there. Always be alert of your surroundings, travel in groups, make noise, yada, yada, yada. You can read those yourself. And then there's a phone number, excuse me, a phone number to phone for the Polar Bear Alert people. They say that they can be to your side within 2 minutes. So they take protecting the residents and the visitors and the bears very seriously. If a polar bear is seen in town, it is first off hazed out using loud noises, firecracker shells, bean bags, that kind of thing, to chase the bears out, even chasing them with their trucks and lights on and all that kind of thing. So the Polar Bear Alert Program has been fairly, well, actually quite successful. But where the really big change came is in 2006, when the town of Churchill finally closed their dump. They buried what remained and they put an electrified fence around it. Today, garbage now is trucked into a concrete building that the locals refer to as the Alcatraz of garbage. So it's been quite a journey for the town of Churchill to go from seeing bears as overgrown rats, essentially, to now seeing them more as a hot tourist attraction and as a cash cow for the stressed, economically stressed town of Churchill. Churchill, the last figures I could get were just prior to COVID, 2017, I guess, 2018, about 10 to 12,000 visitors come to Churchill between the weeks, 6 weeks between mid-October and late November to see polar bears. And that has then earned Churchill the title of being the polar bear capital of the world. Why that is so is that around Churchill during this time, you can almost guarantee that you're going to see bears. They're very predictable, they're very easy to view, and they're relatively accessible if you've got the money to get to Churchill. So it makes it quite a hot tourist item, as I've said. And by the way, there's signs like this everywhere, warning people not to stray out down to the beach. There's a lot of big rocks that you can't see around, and you could find yourself looking into the belly button of a polar bear. Polar bears around Churchill, Churchill itself has been divided into a number of zones. Zone 1 is the immediate living and working space. Zone 2 is the inhabited perimeter, and then Zone 3 is the remote area. As I think you can probably guess, bears are least tolerated within Zone 1. And if a bear refuses to leave after, I believe it's 3 times, if a bear returns more than 3 times, it's locked up in this facility. This is the bear holding facility, or what is called the polar bear jail. Since 1982, when it was first created out of an old Quonset hut left over from the military, it has been fortified, by the way. It has held over 2,000 bears to date. Inside that, there's 28 holding pens, 5 of which have air conditioning in case of warm weather. Um, Generally, during this time of mid-October to late November, if a polar bear is put in here, it's held for a minimum of about 30 days. That 30 days is timed with the formation of ice on the Hudson's Bay. Once the ice is formed and they release the bears, they know the bears will head directly out on the ice. The bears have been fasting, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but the bears have been fasting for a long period of time, and so they are anxious to get out and hunt for seals. While the bears are in the holding facility, they are not fed. They are provided with water or snow. And the reason they're not fed, of course, is they don't want these bears to become habituated or food conditioned by people. If you walk around back of this polar bear holding facility, you'll encounter this huge mural. This mural was painted as part of a 2017 art project called the Seawalls Churchill. It was the intention of this art project was to educate and inspire the community of Churchill to protect the oceans. But really what transpired was is that the art project became a very powerful way of helping this town of Churchill that had gone through a major collapse due to the pullout of the military and then the closing of the railway. Everything just sort of came together and morale in the town was really dropping. And so the art project led to the creation of about 18 murals. This is one of them. It was painted by the project leader, Kel Barteski. She is an artist from Winnipeg, and the mural is of a sleeping bear, of a lazy bear, pardon me, a lazy bear. And this is what many polar bears are doing at this time. Remember, I said that they've been fasting for a long period of time since the ice melted and retreated away. So most polar bears at this time are essentially in what some biologists call a walking hibernation, and they are just simply resting, trying not to burn up energy. The area that people go in to visit or to observe polar bears is the Churchill Wildlife Management Area, and it was created in 1978. It was established to protect polar bear staging area and denning areas. And it also provides protection for nesting areas for geese and habitat for caribou. So this is where the polar bears tend to congregate. It's only 10 kilometers away from Churchill. So that further underscores just how accessible it is to view polar bears in and around Churchill. The area, prior to becoming a wildlife management area, was a part of the military's rocket range. And so what is used out here to view polar bears are all the old roads and tracks that were established by the military. To get into this area requires having a special permit. Not everybody can just drive in here. In 1984, a cap of 18 permits was set, and that's one permit per vehicle, per tundra vehicle, and I'll show you what they look like in a minute. 12 of those permits are held by Frontiers North. That's the name of the company I mentioned earlier that started the whole business of polar bear viewing. And 6 are held by the Great White Bear Tours. At any one time, only 12 of these tundra vehicles are allowed in there. And as I mentioned, they're restricted in where they can go. This is what a tundra vehicle, this is showing you where the Churchill Wildlife Management Area is relative to Churchill. As I said, it's about 10 kilometers east of Churchill. Okay, so this is what one of the tundra vehicles looks like. From the outside, huge wheels to navigate through the tundra and through a lot of the shallow lakes that you find around there. That extension off the back is a deck. The deck floor itself is wire mesh. So if the bears should happen to walk underneath, you can look directly down at them. Inside, they're pretty cozy. Each of these tundra buggies or tundra vehicles can hold up to 50 people. They're heated, generally a very comfortable ride in, although it can be quite bumpy going into the tundra or over the tundra and through some of the areas where it appears that the permafrost has melted. And this is what it looks like when a polar bear is observed and these tundra vehicles start to converge on the bears. Now, going into this, I was particularly concerned whether or not there was any kind of harassment. I had read articles about how safaris could disrupt lions while they were hunting. And I wondered whether or not there was a similar kind of thing happening here with the polar bears. And what I found was that a 2001 research paper noted that vigilance behavior in the presence of these tundra vehicles significantly increased, with increased bouts of the head going up and looking and then going down. And what they noticed also is that the time between those bouts of head up, head down also increased as the activity of the buggies increased. So overall, bears were observed to be 2.5 times more vigilant in the presence of these tundra vehicles than when the vehicles weren't present. And females showed even a greater response to the tundra vehicles. And another study I found noted that the vigilance also increased metabolic rates, leading to further burning of precious calories. Now, having said that, some bears just couldn't care less that we were there. This guy paid us no attention at all. And this one proceeded to do what we call polar bear yoga. First things, of course, you have to choose a soft mat. In this case, this bear chose a snowbank. And then it checked around to make sure no other bears were watching. And then it did its opening stretch. So the head's well back, the nose pointed almost horizontal, forepaws up straight in the back, and the legs out at the back. This is a great exercise, by the way, for opening up your lower back. Now, during the 2 weeks I was there, I observed roughly 30 to 35 bears. I'm sorry I lost track of just exactly how many it was. Of those 30 to 35 bears, 2 approached the tundra vehicles. One got fairly close, and then somebody on that tundra vehicle dropped something and it clattered, and the clatter scared the bear away. This one, however, really showed that it was unafraid and walked up to us and then proceeded to get as close as possible to us. Now, on board, when this bear did this, we were in the middle of having some lunch. So very clearly, this bear could smell it. By the way, if you're trying to guess the height of this bear, there's lines on the side of the vehicle, and this bear's nose is touching right at just about the 11.5 foot mark. So roughly 4 meters high. One wonders what it'd be like to encounter one of these things in the night, or as you're out walking. Can be pretty scary, obviously. There are some simple rules that the guides are very strict about. No food or drink are allowed out on the rear deck. As I mentioned, it has a wire mesh, and any food or drink could fall to the ground and attract bears. Same applies with not holding any food or drink out the windows. That's an obvious. Here's one, though, that I think sort of put people on high alert. No sticking arms out of the window with your cameras without first checking to see what's below. And then last but not least, if you drop it over the side, it stays there. If it's your camera, your phone, your hat, your jacket, whatever, it stays there. No one is going to get out of the vehicle to go retrieve it for obvious reasons. One of the interesting behaviors that we observed was that polar bears traveling together. And researchers have noticed that polar bears can and do often form friendships, wherein a pair will spend time over days, even weeks, traveling together. And during this time, they'll engage in play fighting, or what is called sparring. And this happens at the time when these bears are fasting, which raises an interesting question. Why would these bears engage in this kind of activity when conserving energy should be the priority? Well, despite all sorts of studies, we still don't know exactly why they engage in this activity. It's theorized that it could be one of two reasons. One, by having these sparring fights, by having these play fights, a male bear can learn what size of opponent it could actually take on, a potential competitor. So it gets to test its strength against another one. It is also possible that the sparring helps to establish some kind of hierarchy that would be used then to avoid fights in the future. We're not sure, but we observe that kind of behavior. Myself and my guests observe sparring a lot. I should emphasize that despite the fact that we were close enough to these bears while they were having the sparring match, we were roughly about in our tundra vehicle, we were probably about 30 feet away, and we could hear the swats that they were giving each other. We could hear the jaws clack and all that kind of thing, but we never saw any bear draw blood on any other bear. Now, having said that, if you look at this bear that was involved in that sparring match, you'll see that the one right in front of us has some pretty nasty scars right above its eye. And those tooth marks could have easily resulted in the loss of an eye. What we suppose then is that this bear was involved in a fight with a competitor during the mating season. Those do result in serious injuries. We didn't see many females with cubs. Females with cubs tend to stay well away from the males. You recall that all of these bears have been fasting, and to fasting male bear, cubs can look like a tasty treat. The average age for breeding age for female polar bears is around about 6 years. Males tend to breed around about 8 to 10 years. The females generally have 1 to 2 cubs. The pregnant females will journey inland to the forested area where there are snowdrifts that she can dig dens in. The polar bear cubs are generally born sometime between November and early January. And then the mom and the cubs will emerge in their den, from their den in March and April. The cubs you're looking at here are probably cubs of the year. They're probably around about 9 months old. So when polar bear cubs are born, they are hairless, they weigh about a pound, and they fit in the palm of your hand. But they gain weight and size rapidly. As you can see, the first polar bear cub is 15 days old. And then it goes to 1 month old. And you can see the growth rate there. Then we've got this one. It's 3 months old. And then 5 months old. So they grow very rapidly. In 7 to 8 months, a cub can gain weight up to about 100 pounds or 45 kilograms. I mentioned before that the mother's milk is extremely high in fat, about 30% higher in fat than human milk. The cubs will continue to nurse with the mother for another approximately 20 months. So, I've given you a little bit of background then on the polar bears around Churchill. Let's talk about something that I'm sure all of us have heard in the news, that polar bears are the icons for climate change. And that is probably no more true than for these bears around Churchill. Churchill itself has warmed by about 2 degrees since record keeping started in 1980s or 1880s, pardon me. And current projections suggest that another 2 degrees by 2050 under a low carbon scenario, or up to 4 degrees under a high carbon scenario. Polar Bear International has done a study and using research from other experts, they have found that the Hudson's Bay has lost ice cover at the rate of 1 day per year. And over the past 40 years, that has resulted in 40 more days ice-free. What does this mean? Loss of ice equals loss of habitat for these bears, equals less time for hunting, and longer periods of fasting, which means increased weight loss and decreased robustness within the population generally. So let's talk a bit more about that. When polar bears have access to seals, they feast, they gorge, they eat as many seals as they can. And polar bears have the amazing ability to double their body fat when they're hunting seals on ice. But when the ice disappears and retreats north, the seals go with it, and that's when the polar bears have to fast. So now we have the polar bears waiting, and how long do they have to wait? Generally, the polar bears, and this is where I want to focus more on the females, because the females are remarkable in how long they can fast. Generally, females will fast 180 to 190 days, but they've also been known in the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation to fast up to 240 days. That is astounding. This is the longest known period of fasting amongst the mammal species. Males will also fast for up to 4 months as well. The previous photo I should have mentioned, you had a polar bear that was walking along the shoreline looking for something to scavenge. And here we've got a polar bear. You can tell by the dirty nose that it's been digging into the into the peat that's found below the ice in this shallow lake. Here it was looking for something to eat. Uh, None of this foraging behavior adds any appreciable, um, uh, doesn't offset any weight loss during the fasting period. But I guess if you're hungry enough, you'll look for food wherever you can get it. So because of the weight loss that is associated with longer and longer periods of fasting, and I'm sure some of you may have seen the photos on Facebook and elsewhere in social media showing the very skinny bear. Um, well, scientists have developed a polar bear scorecard so that when they're flying or doing any kind of survey by ground, they can tell by the profile roughly the robustness of the bear. Is it very fat? Pardon me. Is it very fat, or is it right down to skinny? Excuse me. Let's return to that female, because this is where the most serious impacts of climate change are happening. When a polar bears mate in July and May, and the fertilized egg will not embed immediately. I know that many of you know this. And so in early fall, mid to late October, the pregnant female will dig a den in a snowdrift to give birth sometime in November, December, as I said. However, if the female does not have significant body fat to get her through the winter, she will not give birth. This is called delayed implantation. And since more and more pregnant female polar bears are in poor condition, we are having fewer and fewer cubs being born. This also means fewer young female bears, which are critical to sustaining the population. And what we're starting to see as well with the loss of the sea ice, we're starting to see inbreeding amongst the polar bears and a loss of genetic diversity as well. So in 1987, Ian Sterling and Andrew DeRoche did a preliminary population estimate of 1,200, and I've put a star beside it because it was an estimate. The methodology wasn't to the same degree of rigor that we are now able to apply, but it was the best guess at the time. So we can't make a direct comparison between 1987 and 2021, which would lead us to believe there's been a 50% decline. But what we can say almost without any kind of quibble is that between 2017 and 2021, the polar bear population around Churchill has collapsed by 27%. That's significant. And as some researchers are saying now that complete reproductive collapse could happen by 2060 or sooner. And the bears will likely be extirpated before the end of this century. So looking pretty grim. So where does this leave the town of Churchill then, which has built its reputation and much of its tourism is predicated on polar bears? Well, needless to say, they're looking at fallback, and understandably so. The total tourism revenue to Churchill is around about $37 million in direct expenditures. Polar bear tourism generates 7.2 million. That's almost 20% of the tourism revenue. So you can understand why the town of Churchill, the mayor, council, and business interests are all very concerned about what happens when there are too few bears or no bears at all to attract tourists. Well, they are doing everything they can to promote whale watching, dog sledding, and Northern Lights viewing. I might add that Northern Lights viewing is a very sketchy proposition because of the presence of Hudson's Bay, which creates cloud cover. Going back to those terminals, historically, the terminals relied upon grain shipments, but now um, they are seeking to diversify and find other ways to make money with that terminal that was built. Uh, some of the things they're looking at are the cruise ship industry. Can they attract cruise ships in here and perhaps use the cruise ships, uh, people off the cruise ships to take them out on the rail line? The other one, which I find more than just a touch ironic, is they're also looking at shipping Alberta oil, gas, and bitumen out through the port here. Needless to say, this has some of the residents very concerned about potential spills and explosions. Meanwhile, there is this whole notion of last chance tourism. And the last chance tourism, the phrase of itself, was first coined in 2008, if I remember correctly, and it was coined in relationship to the polar bears in Churchill. This is a really excellent paper for those of you interested in last chance tourism. I've lifted out some of the salient bits from this paper. So, and I'm just going to quickly read through it here. Just move. So, while climate change continues to negatively impact polar bears, tourists are traveling to northern regions like Churchill for a chance to see these bears before they're extirpated. This demand to travel creates a paradox in that not only are last chance tourism destinations vulnerable to change, but due to the dependence on energy intensive modes of transportation, accommodations, and local activities, these tourism destinations are anthropogenic factors influencing change. Good. Now, hang on a second. That should, why won't it advance? Oh, hang on a second. For some reason, why did it stop advancing?
Rick, are you unable to see your cursor?
No, I can see my cursor.
Okay, can you go back one?
Oh, that's an interesting question. No. What the heck is that about? Just what I did was, just as an aside, what I did was is that okay. No,
Can you hit your escape button?
Yeah, I guess I accidentally did that. Okay, anyway, a polar bear viewing experience is estimated to be between 6 and 34 times more energy intensive than the average global experience. Moreover, the authors found that although tourists believed climate change was occurring, they did not understand how their travel behavior influences these change. On top of all this, there are those operators up in Churchill who are trying to capture, to capture this last chance tourism. And in 2020, during COVID, the Conservative government of Manitoba, provincial government, quietly slipped lazy bear expeditions 2 permits to take their vehicles back into the restricted area. Needless to say, this really upset the tour operators that were not consulted. It upset the First Nations as well. They were not consulted. This was all done on the sly, I think it's fair to say. The owner of Lazy Bear Expeditions, I feel it's fair to say, is a very strong supporter of the Progressive Conservative Party, even ran for it in 2011. It broke the moratorium of 1984, and it sparked the polar bear expert Andrew DeRoche to write a formal letter to the Manitoba government. And in it, he said, increasing the number of tundra vehicles is a change to the existing situation. And for a population of polar bears in decline and under increasing pressure from climate change, a precautionary approach is advisable. I think he probably could have said it more strongly. So how has this experience affected me? Well, at first, I was very excited to be given the opportunity to lead this tour. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. And like most people, I was already aware of the threatened status of polar bears due to climate change. But after several weeks of struggle, and I do mean struggle, that I shared on Facebook with many of my friends, I made the decision to go. And in going, I hoped I would have opportunities to educate my guests about the plight of the polar bears and the impacts of climate change. But these opportunities never really came to be. We were pretty much in the hands of the local tour operator and his guides the whole time, and by and large, they avoided the topic. As a consequence, I felt increasingly guilty for being there. Upon arriving home, I dug deeper into the research, and that's when I learned about the carbon-intensive polar bear. That's when I learned how carbon-intensive polar bear viewing was, and how little the experience actually changed behavior of people regarding the footprint of their travel. This was incredibly disheartening to me. I also came across the news articles that revealed the controversy surrounding the local tour operator who took us out on the tundra. In the end, I've made the decision not to lead the tour again. This decision has likely cost me the opportunity to lead other tours for that company that hired me. I get such immense joy out of being a tour guide, but I struggle to reconcile my work with a commitment to reducing my carbon footprint as much as possible. My decision may not make any difference to the fate of the polar bears in Churchill, but at least by not leading these tours again, I'm not contributing to a carbon-intensive experience that is only making the climate change threat to these bears worse. And I hope, by sharing my experience and my concerns, that others will reflect deeply on their travel choices as I am on mine. Thanks for listening, folks. Any questions at all?
Wow, that was very powerful, Rick. Thank you so much. Really, such an important thing for us all to think about, and I applaud you for your decisions. And yeah, it's just so tragic, really sad, and such an incredible animal. So yeah, let's open it up to questions. I see, Tom, you have your hand up. Go for it.
Oh, I have 6 questions.
Go for it, Tom.
Wow. Well, boy, remarkable presentation. I have a few sort of lighthearted and a couple more heavy-duty issues. I can perfectly believe that the declining ice cover is sort of the overwhelming issue, but obviously polar bears eat seals and seals eat fish. So, like, what is the seal density, or has the seal density changed over the last 2 or 3 decades? Do you have any context of that at all?
No, I don't for sure, Tom. I was told that the seal population is still very strong, but I haven't verified that.
Okay, all right. That would be an unusual situation if the population of fish is as much as it was before. Like globally, you know, there's been such a decline in so many oceanic basins. So, okay, I mean, that's reasonable. The other issue, second here, is it's more sort of form and function for a predator in which camouflage is such a remarkably important component for so obvious reasons. I don't understand why the eyes and the nose continue to remain completely exposed and visible, because that must be, there must be all sorts of simple ways to mask that. Like what?
Okay, so here's the thing: when a polar bear is stalking a seal, it will actually cover its nose with its paw. So the
Oh,
only the eyes show. And here's something else for you, Tom. I think it was in Ed Struzik's book, Arctic Icons, where he talks about the conservation officers in Churchill back in the 80s having to deal with one polar bear that was exceptionally good at hiding itself when it came into town. It learned to recognize the sound of the truck. And when he heard the truck coming, it would lay down and cover its nose and look like just a big snowdrift.
that's a good story.
Well, Ed Struzik's book is laced with great stories. I strongly recommend it.
Yeah. Yeah, like, but primates, we don't have a black nose. Like it's sort of like, what is it about, you know, so many carnivores, you know, cats and dogs and wolves, etc. Like obviously it's a main sensory device, but it just always puzzled me that it has to be black, you know, that just sort of,
Yeah.
but anyway,
Yeah.
but Mark, and the other thing, I mean, I really appreciate your decision here after reflection of the impact, and I'm sort of I would do the same. But if you think of ecological footprint, your footprint might go from 7 to 8 or something like that when you factor in those trips. From my perspective, if you've had even one kid, your footprint goes from 8 to 16. And so the relative impact of doing these polar bear trips to me is such a small percentage of what you would have contributed had you had one kid, least of all 2 or 3, etc., because you literally double or triple, etc. And I think until society takes into account that individual contribution of producing more individuals on this, basically on this per Earth, and focuses on pedaling down to the bike to the drugstore with your bike rather than taking your car. If you focus on those little things, I mean, in some ways, something is better than nothing, but not when you sort of ignore that bigger context. So, anyway, at some point, I would probably go back to Churchill at some point before you get too old. Anyway, that was just my comment. So. Excellent presentation.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions for Rick? Let me just check the chat. Yeah, it looks like there's a couple in the chat here. Sorry, I had to jump off for a second, so I'm not sure. I apologize if you've already answered these, but I'll read them out here. Could noses be black for the warmth of the air going in and out? And another adaptation, the long sensitive nose to odors.
Yeah, the nose I don't think the blackness of the nose has much to do with the warmth, but in the nasal passage, I had a photo of the nasal passage that, for brevity, I dropped from the program. But it has more, what are they called, turbidinites? Like our nose has a bunch of ridges, and so as the air, that increases the amount of skin or cell coverage that would absorb oxygen and warm the air. Well, polar bears have even more of that, and so that long nose gives it, amongst other things, not just better scent, but also as they suck the air in, cold air in, it's more surface area to warm that air before it gets into the lungs. It's another remarkable adaptation of polar bears to the Arctic environment, to cold weather.
We've got another comment here in the chat. Your comment regarding last chance tourism reminded me of how many other species nearing extinction were hunted by museums, academic institutions, and collectors, actually pushing the species to extinction rather than trying to give the population support to survive.
Mm-hmm. True enough. True enough.
Sorry, another question in the chat. How far and long can they swim?
That's a really good question. I don't know, to be honest. What I do know is that as the polar bears around Churchill become weaker, their ability to swim longer distances is being compromised. They simply don't have the energy. And they are also becoming more and more susceptible to hypothermia. Again, just due to eroded robustness. So I don't know what the exact distance is or how long they can swim. I do know that they tend to minimize the distance. They prefer to hunt on the ice. They will dive into the water, of course, to stalk a seal, but they prefer short swims to get close to a seal. So they're not typically long distance swimmers, but we're seeing increased frequencies of polar bears being forced to do long distance swims as the ice continues, and that's more so, from what I understand, in the high Arctic, not so much so in Hudson's Bay. It's a good question, though. I'll have to do a bit more research on that.
Rick, it's Dawn here. Just putting these questions
hi, Dawn.
into you. This has been a fantastic presentation. I really like both the science you put behind it and the ethical questions that we all face on this. In response to Tom's, and I agree with that fully. I mean, I've cut our home's emissions by 97%, and my vehicles are up in about 90% range. But when I look and I see, I don't know how many of you have looked. If you haven't, look in The Guardian for a report that came out on the weekend that they published in response to methane leakages and massive methane leakages that are going on around the world, especially in places like Kazakhstan. Absolutely massive, like the equivalent of all the vehicles used in a major country being released in a matter of routinely in a lot of these places. And including here in BC, one of the hot spots is the Montane region of British Columbia, where all of our natural gas is coming from that we want to ship off to God knows where through the Canada LNG project. So while our government is doing things, we're doing things as individuals, and while we have all these programs to subsidize electric cars and put heat pumps in our house and all that kind of stuff, which is good, and I think we have to do that. But then you turn around and you see industry and the government getting together and putting in the LNG Canada plant up in Kitimat will emit life cycle 128 million tons of carbon a year compared to BC's current total inventory emissions they report now of about 65 million tons. So that's doubling our emissions. And we're going to try and reduce, I mean, we're still increasing our emissions every year. So it just seems that we're doomed. We can't, it's just like your people couldn't relate their traveling to the north with the carbon expenditure that does, and probably in the wintertime they took the cruise ship summers. So I mean, we're doomed as a species, and we're dooming everything else with us. It would seem we just don't have the willingness to change.
So 2 parts to that, Don. You're right. I recognize that my decision not to lead this trip is like not even a drop in the ocean. It's much smaller than that. But from an ethical point of view, I just couldn't partake in a tourism experience that research has shown is anywhere from 6 to 34 times more carbon intensive. I just ethically, I couldn't do it. And the reason I couldn't do that is, as I said in my talk, I am working hard at a personal level, at a household level, as well as at a professional level, to keep my my total footprint as small, as low as possible. So at least if my nephew, who is 18-year-old, turns to me and says, "So what'd you do when you knew?" I can honestly say to him, I did everything I could to reduce my footprint. So that's, I recognize that, it's a very, very tiny contribution, but it's important to me, and so I feel good. I feel comfortable doing it. And certainly on your latter point, the research is not hopeful, and I think it really comes down to, are we as individuals prepared to make sacrifices, and are we as a society, as a nation, prepared to push our politicians to enforce some of those necessary changes? That's really what I think it comes down to. A good friend of mine, Robert Sanford, who some of you may know, has put it out there that he suspects that before too long, discretionary air travel will no longer be permitted, because the climate change crises will be such that we'll be finally forced to our knees to accept that some things that we've taken for granted just cannot continue. We'll see whether or not his prediction comes true or not. It ain't over until it's over, Don.
I guess. Thanks, Rick.
You're welcome, Don. What other questions we have there, Steph, or how much longer do you want to go?
Oh, as long as everybody wants to keep going.
All right.
Let's see. But maybe okay.
People can leave whenever they want.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So we'll just give you such a big thank you, Rick, for sharing and for such an important topic and such incredible photos of such a special place. And And if anyone would like to stay a little bit longer to discuss or have more questions, please feel free. But otherwise, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and hope to see you again next month. And in the meantime, feel free to unmute or continue any comments or questions in the chat. But I know it's getting late, so we'll see who wants to stick around.
I see we still have 60-some people, so that's pretty good. Whoops,
Yeah.
it's dropped pretty quick.
Past everyone's bedtime.
It's just dropped to 30. Last week I went out to UVic to a lecture or a talk by a German professor who's in town, a lady who was completing a major project with hundreds of other scientists around the world on basically, is it possible to keep emissions to 1.5 degrees, or is it even plausible to be able to keep it to 1.5 or 2 degrees warming? And they come out somewhat optimistic. But one of the questions I raised with them is we're all here about our oil and gas industry and our governments committing to net zero for the oil and gas industry by the year 2050. And do you know what net zero means as a percentage of the life cycle emissions of those industries?
Sorry, was that a question to me, Don?
Yeah, just you and anybody else.
No.
To save time, it's about 12% of the emissions.
Mm.
So in the oil, in tar sands in particular, tar sands are a bit higher than the others, but the tar sands, about 13% of the emissions of the oil produced in the tar sands is in the digging it out of the ground or steaming it out of the ground, and the processing of it and refining of it to get into your gas tank. And to transport it to the border of the country. We only consider the emissions within Canada. We do not consider emissions outside of Canada. But even if they were in Canada, for the industry to declare itself net zero, it has to reduce about 13% of the emissions related to the oil that they extract. And 90% of it, 85% is on combustion. But we talk and we sing the praises of being net zero, which is so dishonest in my view, so unethical. But that's where we are.
Yeah, it really underscores just how important it is that we become informed about not just about the climate change and all the impacts, but also become really informed on these kinds of topics that you're raising, Don, so that we're able to, push back through our MPs and MLAs, to seek the kinds of changes that are absolutely necessary for us not to exceed 1.5 and for us to absolutely not hit 2 degrees Celsius of warming. I refuse to say we're doomed, but it certainly doesn't look good.
Well, something like 70% of our new vehicles sold are still half-ton trucks and SUVs. So even after all we know, and the emissions in the transportation sector and light vehicles continue to rise because more and more people are buying half-ton trucks and larger SUVs, which have such a huge footprint compared. The cars reductions from the cars are actually going down, but light vehicles, which includes SUVs and trucks, are going up, and they're going up much more than the cars are going down. Anyway,
the number one selling vehicle in the U.S. right now is the Ford 150 half-ton.
Yeah, well, four of the top best-selling cars in Canada last year are half-ton trucks. The F-150, the Silverado, the whatever the GM one is called, and the Ram. The 1 and 2 are Rams. F-150 and the Ram. And then there's the third, I think, is the Toyota CR, or what is it? RAV4, and then the two Chevy half-ton trucks, Chevy and GM half-ton trucks are the other two that make up the top 5. So yeah, we're not making much
Right.
progress.
Nope, we got a long
Anyway.
ways to go.
We do, but and the politicians won't change until we drive them to change, and that's how do you get that message through? And when enough people get on board, it doesn't help. I think we now have a premier that doesn't drive a half-ton truck at least.
Right.
He's the only one in Western Canada probably who doesn't. Anyway,
Yeah.
so thank you very much again.
All right.
It was a really a good presentation. I'm going to send it to John Whitaker and Hamill and those guys in Manitoba and my Manitoba friends as well. Once it's up on YouTube, I'll send them the link.
Thank you. Thank you, Don.
Spread the message. Okay.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Yeah, it's a great idea. We'll put it on YouTube and share it around. And yeah, well, thank you very much.
You
It's getting late, so let's call it an
Yep.
evening. And thanks so much, Rick. That was just such a fantastic presentation and very thought-provoking.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks so much, Rick. A beautiful presentation, and I'm glad it's been recorded and it's going to be put up for us to look at again on YouTube. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome, Gordon. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good night,
All right.
everyone.
Good night.
Good night. And share.
Yeah.